Fear Not, Episode 110. Hi, I'm Billy Atwell, and I believe that consistently facing your fears is the only way to realize your truest self and to make those confident choices that will help you to obtain your deepest held hopes and dreams. I have faith that this podcast series will show you that you are not alone, that it will strengthen you and give you courage to face your fears, and that it will help you to permanently cross over into a life of living beyond your fears. Join me on this journey as we listen and learn from others as they share their experiences in facing and overcoming their own fears. Hello, everybody. Today, you and I are going to be joined by Dr. Jessica Zitter. Hello, Jessica. How are you today?
I'm doing just fine, thank you.
Jessica is a national advocate for improving the way people die in America. She practices the unique combination of critical and palliative care medicine at Highland Hospital, a public hospital in Oakland, California. She's the author of the newly released Extreme Measures: Finding a Better Path to the End of Life. She's also a regular contributor to the New York Times and the Huffington Post, and her writings have also appeared in The Atlantic, Time, and Journal of the American Medical Association. She has also appeared on CBS Sunday Morning and NPR's Weekend Edition. Jessica, can you take a few moments to fill in those gaps and maybe also give us a brief glimpse of your personal life?
Definitely. I grew up in a family of doctors and always wanted to be a doctor from the time I was a little kid. And I saw it as this heroic subspecialty, kind of like firefighters. And I went into it and went into the most what I considered heroic of the subspecialties, pulmonary and critical care medicine, and really was in for a surprise. It wasn't what I had been expecting. And so over these past 20 years or so of practice, I've kind of come had an about face in terms of how I think about heroism in medicine and what we're set here to do. And so now I do a lot of writing and I still practice medicine and I try to think about how we can change this infrastructure in a way that makes more sense for all of us, doctors and patients and nurses and everyone else.
Jessica, could we start off by having you give us your definition of what fear is?
Yeah. Um, Having experienced it many times in my life, past, present, and future, I would define fear as this wall that can be in the path of actions that you're doing or paths that you're moving along. And sometimes you can get over that wall, and sometimes you just bypass it and do something different. But it can really be a powerful barrier to getting where you need to go.
Jessica, I know a lot of your work deals with end of life and death, and a lot of people obviously have a lot of fear surrounding that. So I was hoping we could talk today about how to face that in a much healthier way and to get over that fear.
Absolutely. I mean, I think, death anxiety is actually a psychological term. There are psychologists who work on this concept. It's a known phenomenon. It's certainly not uncommon. There are a lot of people who actually have come to the attention of the psychology world as people who have death anxiety and just really get completely sidetracked by their fear of death. And if you look back, through the millennia, really, to the earliest times that we have recorded. I mean, some of the earliest Greek myths kind of show us that this fear of death is something that humans have felt throughout. Uh, I think it's not that this constant search for the fountain of youth, this search for perpetual life. It goes way back in our storytelling. So I think it makes sense. We're a biological species and we are completely created and bred to keep going, to keep that drive to stay alive and to create our own progeny. And I think a certain amount of death, a fear of death, is part of the normal part of being a human being. But I think it becomes death anxiety when it really starts to prevent someone from being able to process this this logical part of life that we're all going to die to their detriment. We're to the point that they're actually unprepared and unable to get what ultimately what they want.
So, how do we go about making that transition from a unhealthy perspective to a healthy perspective?
It's so it's a combination of many issues. There's the personal tendencies, for some people more, for some people less, to abhor or to avoid or to deny the possibility that death will happen. But there's also this societal element that we all know about that 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 perpetuates and supports that. You just turn on TV and you watch Grey's Anatomy, and you can see that our society really craves this avoidance as well, and has built in an entire media that supports this, in a way, fantasy that death really is beatable and avoidable. So it's a combination of personal work, I think, as well as societal acknowledgement that this is something that we're not really processing in a logical way that's allowing us to be well prepared for this reality of all of our lives.
So, in order to change society, I mean, we have to go back to ourselves, right? And so we needed to change ourselves, and thus that would impact. So, what could we do specifically to make those changes within ourselves so that the society at large can also be affected and make a shift?
Yeah. Well, I think that changing ourselves is important. I also think that at the same time, in parallel, creating new types of television shows, new types of movies, new types of literature can help the rest of society also start to process this through. So I think there's sort of a parallel that we need to both be working on our individual mindfulness about death, and but I think we also can start to feed into society, for popular culture, more death acknowledgement. And of course, some people will still continue to avoid it, but as the culture starts to have access to new reality and new information, they that will start to change the culture in and of itself. So, for example, I mean, I've been really amazed by the incredible growing grassroots movement of wanting, accepting, and not only that, but demanding more information from larger and larger numbers of people when they have access to an article that talks about death. People are just clamoring for more information. Every time I write an article in the New York Times, there's 60, 100 people writing in, and this what feels like a groundswell to me of acknowledgement and interest in this topic. So having that in the ambience, in the environment around people, will make everybody, even those who are individually less likely to want to talk about death or maybe more anxious about it, start to accept it a little bit more. I look at myself, for example, and I tell them in my book a story of even as I'd been talking about this issue about bad dying in America for years, I still hadn't really looked at my own death, and I have this moment just a few years ago where I went into this lecture called Mindfulness in the ICU, and it was a moment where they were teaching us how to look at our own death and how to think about our own death, and I realized in that class that I had never ever really deeply thought about my own death, the sort of the details of it, and who would be there, and who would be sad, and who would be at my bedside. And it was very emotional for me. And I found we were all sitting in this circle, and I felt myself really kind of tears running down my face and wanting to sob. And it was kind of embarrassing. But there was something about that moment, again, which happened years ago, that sticks with me. And I think was a moment where I kind of came a notch more into being more able to confront death and confront my own death. And you would have thought that I, as a doctor who deals with patients dying all the time, would have processed it and been more ready for this earlier. But it really was an act. It was an activity that I engaged in that opened me up a little bit more to this topic.
So, how did you process it? How did you come to that resolution? I'm assuming you came to a resolution about your own mortality. So, what was that?
Well, I don't think that moment, uh, that was a moment where I had this one epiphany, oh, that I'm going to die. I mean, I think logically and cognitively, I always knew I was going to die. And this was just, it was a movement, maybe even spiritually, maybe emotionally, a movement towards being able to really picture that moment. And I still go up and down in my life of being more afraid of death or less afraid of death, and but that moment sticks in my head as having brought me a little bit closer in terms of the bell curve towards being able to process and think about death. If Atul Gawande's book Being Mortal, if which I know a lot of people have read, really talks about that I as people age, or as people get sicker, they are more realistic about death and dying. And I think that that's part of it too. That as we get older, I think that many of us begin to be able to perceive and think about it, and even plan for it a little bit more easily than when we were younger. And I think it's a really interesting point because young people still die. And so if we're going to just leave it to the older people to be prepared for death, many, many young people won't be prepared when it's their turn. So I think getting this to be a societal exercise where it just becomes part of what you do as your due diligence, like buying insurance, it will start to, number one, prepare us logistically for it, and also change this cultural denial of death.
Is there some sort of neurological component to this that when you age, it just, I don't know, something inside your brain sort of kicks in? Or is it, is it just through experience?
I don't have an answer to that. I haven't looked at the science, the neuroscience behind this. I'm sure there is one, honestly. But I would, having watched many patients with serious illness get progressively sick and progressively debilitated over time, and watching them go from not really accepting that there's death in the future to really starting to accept it and process it. I would say that it really partly, I'm sure there's a part of this that's just related to biological, um, I don't know, a biological winding down as your body starts to get tired, as you start to feel your illness or your age or your frailty catching up with you. You you develop you adapt as a human being, and we're very adaptable. And so I think when people do have time to process death or time to process old age, they're more likely to get to a point where they can handle it and plan for it. But as I said, there are so many cases of people that I take care of who are young, or trauma victims who are young, who really never would have gotten to that stage, and suddenly find themselves there, that it seems to me will do better for all of us if we start to make this a routine part of the way we think about our healthcare and our health.
Where could you guide us to gather more information so that we can become more knowledgeable and equipped?
There's a lot of great resources for this, and um, I would start with, I mean, I've pulled together many of the resources in my book in the appendix, and I find that very helpful. I think a lot of people have found it helpful, so I would recommend that as a place that the place that I personally know that pulls together many of the resources that I think are most easy to use and most helpful. Um, but there's wonderful resources out there. There's, of course, books and articles that come out now more and more with increasing frequency in the newspapers, stories of people going through these different types of experiences that can be very illustrative and educational for readers. And then, of course, there's a lot of websites. There's prepareforyourcare.org, which can help people sort of think through how they want to create an advance directive. There's um, there's uh, a game that I love to recommend to people called Go Wish, which you can find online, and is a great segue for families and friends. in starting this conversation and getting people to start the conversation to really be thinking about what are the most important things to you and how do you want to live right up until the end. There's the Conversation Project, which is a terrific resource for, again, getting this conversation started, starting to think about this. For some people, seeing a personal therapist to talk about it and to talk about particular death anxieties if those exist, or just to talk about how you want your life to be as effective as it can be all the way to the end can be very helpful as well. Some people find mindfulness exercises to be helpful. I certainly did, as I described. And there's so many different ways to approach this, but there are a lot of resources out there, and getpalliativecare.org is another great website that I think your readers would find helpful. But there's a more increasing amount of support to help people process through this and really start to make their plans so that they feel more in control and, frankly, less anxious. So, as far as steps that people can take, part of it depends on where you are right now. If you're a completely young and healthy person who's living a vibrant life, I would recommend that you start to have this conversation about your preferences and how you want to live all the way to the end with your loved ones. I have a friend who plays this game, Go Wish, every single year on her anniversary with her husband. And thank goodness these two are vibrant couple, and hopefully living together for many decades going forward. But they spend time doing this game, Go Wish Together. And from that, they're developing this robust understanding of what is completely essential for each of them uh, to have in their lives all the way through to the end. And there is a certain kind of comfort and confidence that comes with that, re-examining how you want to live and stating it to your loved one who will be there with you as a support and possibly your spokesperson if you can't speak for yourself. There's something incredibly empowering about doing that kind of an activity that I think gives people a tremendous amount of comfort. And I know it has for me. I've played it with my kids. I think they feel empowered to have those conversations and to know that they will always be able to sort of be in control and that they're being listened to about what's really important to them in their lives. So that is something that everybody should be doing way upstream from getting sick or ill. Just putting that into part of your yearly practice, your monthly practice, just communicating with your loved ones about how you want to live. It's empowering and it's comforting. I think for, people who actually already have somebody who's got a serious illness, whether it's themselves, they're getting sicker with a serious illness, or a loved one who's very ill in the hospital or at home, that's a different type of preparation where there's a little bit more urgency to start to have these conversations because there's realities looming, like what if you need to be put on a breathing machine? Would that be acceptable to you? So having those conversations at a later stage in illness, there are different techniques to do that as well. And part of it includes talking with your doctors and getting your doctors to talk to you, which can be tough because doctors are trying to be, helpful and hopeful. And sometimes they can say that things are kind of going along or imply that things are going along okay when they're really not. And when when people and patients or their families start to feel that things have actually gotten worse. And so there's a lot of stress and a lot of confusion there. And so figuring out how to communicate with the healthcare team and to get real and honest information can really alleviate fear and anxiety. And one of the things I would say is talk to your doctor and ask for the honest truth. A lot of doctors think that patients only want to hear good news. Tell them you want to hear everything they're thinking. You want to understand all the options. What are they thinking about prognosis? And even though we kind of say, "Oh, I don't really want to know," the truth is, it's the people who start to it's people who know what's happening who can actually prepare. You can't, as I say, you can't prepare for a good death if you don't know that you're dying. And so that is a really important action to ask your doctor for, to insist from your doctor that you get to know what he or she is really thinking, and then to start making plans about how you want to navigate through whatever time it is that you have left. Do you want to use machines? Do you not want to use machines? Would you want to use machines in a temporary way if it might get you better? Or do you never want to use them? These are conversations that your doctor can have with you, but sometimes you need to give permission to them to actually continue that conversation, if that makes sense.
Sure does. And Jessica, if someone would like to connect with you, what's the best way for them to do that?
Well, I have a lot of resources on my website, which is jessicazitter.com, and certainly can um, be recipient. If you sign up for my website, I have a newsletter that comes out about once a month, and I have a lot of information that comes out on Facebook and Twitter, and you can find my Facebook and Twitter handles on that website. So that is definitely a way to get a lot of the pieces of information that I'm sending out all the time that can be very helpful to people. And I hope people will sign up.
And Jessica, is there any parting advice that you'd like to leave with us today?
I think the real advice is this: death is it's hard. It's hard to, see finality to this life that we all lead. And I think it's easy to want to avoid it, and I know it because I do too a lot of the time. But I will tell people, and I tell you, that if you do take the time to confront it, to acknowledge that it will happen, and then to start making plans, hopefully way upstream from when you'll need them, you will find a tremendous amount of comfort from that. I know I have, and I know it's helped me alleviate some of my own death anxiety, and I feel confident that it will help uh, other people as well.
Thank you so much for that. That's something really much to consider. I'm sure most of us haven't. I also want to let everyone know, too, that Jessica has generously donated a copy of her book, Extreme Measures, that we'll be giving away. So if you would like the opportunity to win that book, visit the giveaways page at livingbeyondyourfears.com and submit your free entry form today. Jessica, I really want to thank you for coming on the show today and discussing probably the biggest fear that there is. So thank you so much for sharing your time and your wisdom and your advice.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for joining me today. And remember, you cannot achieve everything, but you do have the God-given ability to achieve anything. So stay focused, out of fear, and keep on keeping on. Until next time, be well and peaceful. For more information on today's episode and guest, or for resources that will assist you in overcoming your fears, visit livingbeyondyourfears.com. And don't forget to subscribe to this podcast, where 3 times a week we move to a life beyond our fears.